Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Thursday, June 26th, 2025, and today we are going to be talking about the state of Texas and John Cornyn, the incumbent United States Senator from the state, facing off against Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton in a head-to-head Republican primary as John Cornyn is losing this GOP primary to a challenger. It's been a long time since a sitting United States Senator has lost a primary. Very limited exceptions. Ones that come to mind are people like Senator Arlen Specter from the state of Pennsylvania, who switched from being a Republican to a Democrat and then lost the Democratic primary. And it is very, very rare to see things like this happen, largely for two primary reasons. The first one is that incumbents typically are incumbents for a reason. They're popular and voters like them, especially voters amongst their own political party. On the second end, typically speaking, the party apparatus and the National Party or the NRSC or the DSCC, these are the senatorial committees that represent the campaign wing of both political parties, would typically involve themselves and avoid a competitive primary because it does damage whoever wins that primary in the general election. And typically speaking, the incumbent is more popular and more electable than the alternative. And we're starting to see now that in the day and age of Donald Trump's second administration, especially with more Trump-like candidates, John Cornyn as a senator who very much represents the old guard of the GOP, ushered in the day and age when John McCain and Mitt Romney were the most prominent figures in the Republican Party. Now we are starting to see a direct primary challenge from the Texas Attorney General, who represents a much more extreme and MAGA vision for the state of New York. And it very much seems like it's working. What we know so far is that in the 2026 race, there's an array of candidates on the Democratic side who are considering running, but nobody has formally announced just yet. Colin Allred, who ran against Ted Cruz in 2024 and lost, but outperformed Kamala Harris by 7 points, is considering running here. Beto O'Rourke, who ran against Ted Cruz and outperformed Hillary Clinton by 7 points, is considering running here. And so there's a lot of conversations being had about people who might want to run, who can run. But on the Republican side, we already know who's running, who's declared, and what the race is shaping up to be. Now, John Cornyn, as the incumbent United States Senator, was elected in the year 2000. And what we knew then was that Cornyn was going to be this mainstay, figure within the Texas GOP. And he had been a consistent overperformer in Texas politics for a very long time, dating back as recently to the 2020 election when Donald Trump won Texas by 5.6%, to which we saw John Cornyn win by nearly 10 points. But this time around, it isn't an issue of electability that John Cornyn is being primaried on, quite the opposite actually, but rather a lack of loyalty to Donald Trump and his administration, at least as perceived by members of the right wing. And John Cornyn hasn't always been this Republican that has been very major. Ted Cruz is a much more notable figure out of the city of New York. The city of New York, I was talking about it earlier today. Sorry about that. The state of Texas. But John Cornyn, as the senator, has been very much party line vote, very loyal to the base, will turn up and vote as necessary for the GOP, and very much does, again, represent that old guard of Texas, but still a day and age in Texas where Republicans were actually winning more than they do today, even after Trump's impressive victory in the 2024 election in Texas. But as you can tell from the title of the Politico article, and as you can tell from what we are talking about in this video, John Cornyn's primary challenger, Ken Paxton, has had remarkable luck in data point after data point, showing him with a trouncing lead over the incumbent United States Senator. The most recent data point comes from Pulse Decision Science, alongside a set of numbers from the University of Texas at Tyler, at which they show the UT Tyler poll has Ken Paxton with a 10-point lead. The Pulse Decision Science poll, Paxton with a 19-point lead. And every single poll that has been done, from even back to 2022, this has been a long time coming for John Cornyn, Ken Paxton has maintained a lead, a strong one, that John Cornyn simply has not been able to overcome. And if anything can further explain this divide between the two, you might not be shocked to know, but you should know, that Ted Cruz, who has served alongside Cornyn since 2012, won't even back his own respective senator in the primary. He won't even endorse him. Ted Cruz, who you remember was the biggest adversary on the right to Donald Trump in that primary in 2016, who has since come around in full-fledged support of the president. Ted Cruz not backing his own senior senator from Texas really says a lot. And when you take a look who has endorsed here, on the Republican side, not that many for Ken Paxton. But on John Cornyn's side, not that many either. You have the Senate Majority Leader who was required to back all of their incumbents. And then you have Rick Scott, Tim Scott, Bill Hagerty, and really, that's it. The NRSC might be backing John Cornyn, but that doesn't mean that everybody else is. And although Ken Paxton isn't in a position where he's reeling in endorsements and doesn't have the endorsement of Trump, he might as well have it, because right now what we're seeing is that John Cornyn is largely seen as being a rhino, Republican in name only, a term very much popularized by Trump, existed before, but popularized more so by Trump, to which he has already called Cornyn a rhino, which is damaging for Cornyn's brand. And looking to this election, well, Paxton might not be someone who is the most electable in the general. We'll get to that in literally just one moment. But Paxton is beating him in the primary. So, what does this mean for Texas in 2026? Well, I want to first start off by saying that I don't think Texas is going to go blue in 2026. I think I have to maintain that because I see a lot of members, on wherever criticizing the things that I say about Texas because they believe that I said Texas would go blue in 2024. Never said that. Never once predicted Texas would go blue ever on the national stage. And that's because it won't. Because Texas in 2026 will still go to the Republican Party. But on the margins, that is what matters. Because it requires a much more significant investment if Republicans are even at all worried about a closening race in a state as large as Texas. Because Democrats have been able to take races in the past. They've been able to win races that maybe had previously gone to the opposition party by a pretty significant amount just 2 years prior. Granted, they had incumbents, but I remember in 2018, the last time Democrats had a wave year, and 2026, for most purposes, will be a Democratic wave year. When you take a look at some of the areas that Democrats were able to do well in, you have states like Ohio that Trump had just won by 8 points. Democrats won by 7. 15-point swing. Trump won Texas by 14 in the last election. A 15-point swing would be enough, in theory, right? Montana. Trump won the state by 20. John Tester won it by 4. That's a 24-point swing, certainly more than the 14 points in the state of Texas. In West Virginia, Donald Trump won the state by 39 points. Joe Manchin wins it by 3.2. That's a 42-point swing. Obviously more than necessary. And while I don't think that this is something that, will translate directly to Texas at all, I am reminded that in 2018, Texas, in fact, was a battleground state. Ted Cruz only won it by 2.6%. And the reason for that was because Ted Cruz was so unpopular and so weak as a Republican candidate that even though he was able to win that primary, largely to no, major pushback, got 85% of the vote, this time around in 2026, you could see something similar come through. Because what we are finding in the general election data is that John Cornyn largely does hold strong against his opponents. But it is Ken Paxton who sees a narrowing of the races in this hypothetical. It is Ken Paxton that in the poll conducted between a generic Democrat and the Republican option, Cornyn wins by 7 and Paxton loses by 3. At worst, it's a 10-point delta. At best, Paxton underperforms Cornyn by 2. And in races that are decided on the margins, a huge difference, if you're equalizing it out, it really can make a difference. And Cornyn, too, like I said, is a consistent overperformer. Outperformed Trump in 2020, but Paxton in 2022 was an underperformer. Even underperformed Greg Abbott. The margin there was better for Abbott than it was for Paxton. And there's reasons for this. Ken Paxton was impeached by the Texas House of Representatives, the Republican House of Representatives, and nearly fully convicted by the Texas Senate. And it came to a point that although he was acquitted, it became a huge deal because what you saw was 70% of House Republicans impeached him in May. 70%. And while he was acquitted because Donald Trump called in a number of favors and a lot of people really wanted to ensure that he was in a good position, it doesn't matter. Paxton is extremely scandal-plagued. He's become less popular since then, largely because of this. And voters in the center and independent voters who might not be polled in these primary data points don't like Ken Paxton. And they very much have good reason not to. And although I don't think Texas will be this battleground state in 2026, if we reach a national environment that was conducive to Texas becoming a 3-point state like in 2018, Republicans do have something to worry about. And not to the degree that they should be focusing on Texas as the primary. But after Trump's impressive victory in 2024, bringing it back from being a state that voted for him by 6, then became a state that voted for him by 14, largely on the backs of Latino voters, what you will find is that it is this state that could also revert back. That if Paxton can't tap in to that Trump base and to Latino voters the same way and can't win over huge swaths of the voting electorate, that Donald Trump was able to do so simply because voters believe that Paxton is corrupt, you have to understand that it is those circumstances that can make Texas more competitive. And it is similar circumstances that led to Ted Cruz being so unpopular and being in a position that the race could even tighten up to that degree. And so I think Republicans might be in for a race that is eventually more competitive than they would have hoped for. And might actually have to spend some money in this race and might actually have to look at this state yet again after they've been promised time and time again that Texas is moving off the Democratic Party's radar. Because I think that it has slightly, but there's still promise there for Democrats in the long term. And investing in it now makes sense. But for Republicans who are looking to 2026, in a year that Democrats are hoping to potentially pick up a state like Maine and North Carolina, and hoping to hold on and retain the seats that they have, setting them up for a potential Senate victory in 2028. You have to look at it from that lens and say, you know what? Democrats are defending a lot of territory, but they're also going on the offensive. The NRSC realistically should not be spending any money in any Republican states outside of North Carolina and Maine. But Democrats might force them to. Democrats might force their hand in states like Iowa. If Joni Ernst ends up running for re-election or not, an open race also might not do that well, depending on who the nominee is, might also force their hand here in Texas. And it would be Ken Paxton who would be the reason for that. Because I do believe John Cornyn would easily win this race. In a primary, if he makes it through, would win Texas by double digits. Maybe 9 points. If the year is conducive enough to Democrats, 8 points. Ken Paxton, I could see it getting as close as it did for Ted Cruz. And I know the national environment is very different, but Paxton is uniquely weak. There have been times where very Republican districts and states have voted against their own presidential party voting by massive margins simply because candidates were too extreme. And while it primarily happens on the gubernatorial level, Texas has actually shown some drastic elasticity when it comes down to Senate races. 2024 is a good example. Kamala Harris lost this state by 14 points. Colin Elrod lost it by 8.5 points. And while that doesn't seem super consequential, it matters a lot. That especially if the national environment goes from being what it was in 2024, a Republican plus 1.5, to being like what it was in 2018, which was Democrat plus 8, you get an environment that makes Texas way closer than it was in 2024 at baseline. And on a Senate level, if you have a candidate like Allred, who is considering running, and a candidate as weak, if not weaker, than Ted Cruz, who can outperform that national environment by 6%, that's how you get close. And that's how, in the most extreme cases, you win. And so I'd keep an eye out on Texas. I'd watch to see what happens in this Republican primary because Ken Paxton has maintained this lead, and it doesn't look like he has any chance of backing down. And while Ken Paxton may not land a Trump endorsement, and John Cornyn may not either, this primary might eventually become wraps. Because what we are going to see is that in the GOP primary, it's going to be very, very interesting to really watch through, to see who decides to endorse who, what ends up happening at the end of the day. Because it will dictate a lot about the general election. Still about a year to go, a lot of time to look at the primary, but right now, numbers aren't looking good for John Cornyn, and they haven't for a while. And chances are, if I was to bet on it, they wouldn't look that much better in a year from today. And I do think right now Ken Paxton is on track to be the Republican nominee for Senate in Texas. And although he may win, that margin might be close, and it puts Democrats within an outsized chance of an upset in comparison to Cornyn, where that chance would be less than 1%. All for Texas Republican voters to decide, but the general election will really make or break it. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video for you to watch, and then a playlist for my 2026 Senate election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.